Hi everyone, Hillbilly Handloader here. Today I'm at the local National Forest Range sighting in the deer rifle I'm going to be using for the general firearms season in Virginia this year. So let's take a couple minutes to go over the rifle setup. The rifle is a Savage 110 action with an 18-inch 308 1-in-10 twist barrel. The barrel originally started on a Savage axis at 22 inches before I bought it off of eBay and did some modification to it. I got my dad, who happens to own a lathe and tinkers with gunsmithing, to cut down the barrel to 18 inches and thread it to 5/8 by 24 so I could mount the suppressor. He had to add a turned sleeve to have enough shoulder for good lockup with the QD brake. The QD brake here is a Yankee Hill Phantom QD and uses an adapter on the suppressor. He just did the tried and true method of turning the sleeve to about 1/1000 smaller than the turn diameter of the barrel, then heated up the sleeve and slid it onto the barrel. The suppressor is a Form 1 that I did with my dad's lathe. The rifle started out as a Savage 110 Tactical in 6.5 Creedmoor with a 24-inch barrel. After burning through about 7,500 rounds in two barrels, one in 6.5 Creed and one in 308, I decided to set this up as a lightweight hunting rifle. I'm still using the original 110 Tactical AccuStock here with the AICS bottom metal and the original AccuTrigger. I know some folks in the long range world are not particularly fond of the AccuTrigger, but I love them. I myself have never had a problem with the AccuTrigger. The only people I've ever seen have trouble with the AccuTriggers are folks that tend to put a bit of sideways pressure on the safety blade that is part of the trigger, causing it to malfunction. The optic on this rifle is a Vortex Diamondback 4-16 by 44 first focal plane MRAD. Yes, it's in a cantilever mount, but that's because the scope was pulled off of an AR for this setup. The cantilever mount is a loophole standard 0 MOA 30mm cantilever like you would use on an AR. I'm a cheapskate and I'm not buying a new set of rings or mount when I can make this work with the adjustable Kydex cheek piece for the height and the generous eye relief on this optic. The bipod is a Harris 6 to 9 inch SBR-M, which has notched legs and the panning feature. It's the best value bipod I've come across, and I've used these on all types of rifles for all types of shooting situations. The sling is a standard GI loop sling that I got off of Amazon and added the quick. The sling is a standard GI loop sling that I got off of Amazon for I think $15. I've had it for a long while. I added a couple quick detach sling swivel mounts on each end of it. You'll notice that I'm not using any type of heavy rest. That's because I prefer to sight in rifles with a realistic field setup. I don't really care what the rifle does on a rest. I care what the rifle is capable of with a realistic field setup. The rear bag I'm using is an Armageddon Gear OG Game Changer with the standard fill. For the ammo, I'm trying out two different hand loads today. Both of these loads were developed for use in long range rifles and not with this barrel. The first load is using 168 grain Hornady AMAX with Remington cases, Remington large rifle primers, and 43 grains of IMR 4064. The second load is using 175 grain Sierra Match Kings with Lake City 762 cases, with CCI mil-spec number 34 large rifle primers, and 41.8 grains of IMR 4064. Yes, both of these loads use match bullets that aren't marketed for hunting. I have seen these bullets used on whitetail in my area to pretty good effect, so I'm not worried about whether or not they'll be effective for me. I'm not using a chronograph today because I won't be taking shots past about 200 yards in any of the hunting spots that I'll be frequenting this year. Appalachian woodlands just don't offer long shots on game very much. If I had to make an estimate, I'd guess the velocity would be about 2575 to 2600 feet per second from both loads. These loads produce about 2725 in my 26-inch 308 barrel. Now before I started the sighting in, I needed to bore sight the scope. I pulled out the bolt and looked down the barrel to get it on target. I then adjusted the scope without moving the rifle off the target and got the reticle lined up where the barrel was pointing at on the target. This got me on the board. Now the target is at 100 yards. It's a standard sight-in range for any type of deer hunting that I'm going to do. Now let's talk about my stance here. You'll notice that I turned the seat to be almost directly behind the rifle instead of off to one side. This is mainly to make sure that the recoil comes straight back into my shoulder and body, allowing me to keep the rifle on target through the recoil. When I shoot long range, this allows me to spot my misses, even with a relatively heavy recoiling rifle like this lightweight 308. I try to make sure I use the positioning for all of my rifle shooting, so it's basically instinctive for me when it comes time for matches. So about the magazines that I'm using. You'll notice that I'm using two different types of magazines here. One mag is a Magpul 10 round AICS mag, and the other is an MDT 12 round AICS mag. I wanted to try both magazines today, get an idea of which magazine fed better with this barrel and action combo. As you can probably tell, it's basically a tie between the two magazines, since Savage Actions tend to have to be run pretty hard for smooth feeding. This action is always fed well when run fast and rough, and only hangs up when I try to be dainty like you see here. I'll probably end up using the MDT mags since they're 12 rounders. Both loads ended up shooting pretty well, with the precision wind going to the load using the Sierra Match Kings. It's not really surprising that the SMKs were more precise, since my other 308 barrels tend to prefer them as well. On the target here, you'll notice that the Sierras printed a pretty solid 5-round group just to the side of the bullseye. Ignore the two shots that looked like flyers. Those were part of the scope zero, getting the scope zeroed earlier. Now, I was too lazy to bring out a caliper to the range, and I'm not really going to worry about measuring this group. It's damn good for any deer rifle that you're going to use in Southwest Virginia.
How are you?
Doing alright. I think we can all agree that the accuracy on that group is quite good for a factory Savage barrel that was chopped off and threaded in a backyard gun shop.